Yeah, just a couple of housekeeping matters before we start. I wasn't born in Cape Town. I'm not Muslim, although the Jewish congregation at which I preach every Friday night and Saturday morning sometimes thinks I'm Muslim. I'm actually Jewish, which means that I'm a member of an ethnic group which for about 2,500 years didn't have a state or an army, until one day in Vienna a very strange journalist called Herzl was not allowed to join a dueling club, and came to the conclusion that he wasn't allowed to join the dueling club because his people didn't have a state. And everything has been going steadily downhill since then. But some of us are determined to restore the status quo to what it was before Mr. Herzl went to his dueling club. And that's why I'm here this evening. Now, I think the best way to introduce what I'm going to say is to begin with a confession, and the confession is that I have many bad habits and many vices of which I'm deeply ashamed. But perhaps none is more disgusting and shameful than my habit of listening to early morning radio. And I was listening to early morning radio on Monday, and there were two items which caught my attention. The one was a debate on water, in which one of the participants was Mike Miller, who was the Director General of Water under Minister Kader Asmal for several years, and who is very committed to the values of a democratic South Africa. And Mike Miller told the story of his exchange with an Israeli colleague who had told him very proudly that Israelis didn't simply regard water as something people drank or something you irrigated land with. Israelis regarded water as an important security resource, and Israelis treated water as a security resource which was designed to protect their state. Now, my colleague Mike Miller mentioned this in much the same way, I guess, as one would mention that there's some people around the world used water in order to conduct industrial experiments, or people around the world used water in order to perform any other task. My point being that Mike Miller, who is sensitized to the horrors of apartheid, didn't seem to find it particularly odd that people in a corner of the world should use water in effect as a weapon of war, which is what he was describing. Secondly, we were told, but I had work to do and I was denied this particular delight, that later in the morning SABC Radio would be giving a platform to a debate. That's what they said it was. A debate on when there would be peace in Palestine. The debate was between Benjamin Pogrund, and Benjamin Pogrund, who I once worked with on the Rand Daily Mail, is best described, because I only have 25 minutes, as the travelling salesman of Israeli human rights abuses. There is nothing the Israelis have done which Benjamin Pogrund has not found a very good excuse for. And Benjamin Pogrund goes around the world justifying the kind of human rights abuses you've just heard about to audiences around the world, particularly in South Africa, because that's where he comes from. The other party to the debate was Bassem Eid, who is best described, because I only have 25 minutes, as whose relationship to Benjamin Pogrund is much the same as a ventriloquist's dummy to a ventriloquist. For those who remember South African history, Bassem Eid is a sort of cross between Lucas Mangope and an urban Bantu councillor. And his job is to accompany Mr. Pogrund around the world to explain that Israeli human rights abuses aren't really abuses at all. Now, this debate was happening not in some right-wing group in the corner of the city. This debate was happening on national radio. And to get serious, it occurred to me that if on the national public radio station of a democratic South Africa in one morning we could have this sort of coverage, it perhaps indicated how much work we still have to do if we want the cause of a democratic Palestine, a cause of justice for the Palestinian people, to be heard in the world. I think it's always good on occasions like these to be self-critical. I think it's always good to admit that we haven't done as well as we ought to, and to admit that we have work to do. And it seemed to me that what I heard on radio on Monday illustrated that we still have a great deal of work to do. Because although I firmly believe, and there's some evidence to support this, that if the majority of South Africans, that if the vast majority of South Africans were told what is really happening in historical Palestine, that those of us who support the Palestinian cause would probably enjoy the support of something like 85% of the South African people. The problem is that we are not getting our message across to the extent that we should. And what I heard on Monday morning is a reminder of how much work we still have to do. And I think that our most urgent task, which we are not addressing to the extent that we should, is to begin to remove from the Israeli state and from understandings of the conflict this notion that we are dealing with some sort of normal state in the Middle East, which happens to be involved in a conflict. Besides trying to challenge this notion of the Israeli state as some sort of normal state in the Middle East involved in a conflict, we also need, and this is perhaps the most urgent task of all, to begin to challenge what I believe is a very widely held view of the conflict in South Africa as well as in many other places. And this is really what I call the real estate view of the conflict. And the real estate view of the conflict is that what is really happening there is that there are these two groups of rather odd people who can't get on with each other and who are fighting over a piece of real estate. And really, when people of conscience around the world and people of goodwill around the world see two groups of rather odd people fighting over a piece of real estate, their immediate response is usually to say, well, surely somebody should knock sense into both of them and get them to actually talk to each other and be reasonable. And that is really about all that people of goodwill could possibly contribute to such a discussion. The problem is that we are not doing as well as we need to do in reframing people's understanding of the conflict. And that sounds like a very academic term. I'm supposed to be an academic. But by reframing the conflict, what we need to do is to begin to impress upon people of goodwill in South Africa and across the world that this is not about two groups of people fighting about real estate, and it is certainly not about some sort of normal state somewhere in the Middle East engaged in a conflict. This is about apartheid. This is about the domination of one group over another. This is about the gross violation of the human rights of the Palestinian people. And that is the reality. I think if one wants to be analytical about the Israeli state and about historic Palestine and about the conflict, it seems to me that what one has to be aware of are two realities, which I think need to be central to everything we do on this issue strategically. And these realities are the following, and I'll expand on them. Looked at from the viewpoint of the dominating group, there is no difference, none that I can discern, between Israeli Zionism and apartheid. I qualify that. I would have made this argument without qualification up until August last year. August last year, I spent a week in Bethlehem and spent a Friday morning in Bethlehem at the checkpoints. And having spent a morning at Bethlehem, I would have to say that there is one massive difference between Israeli Zionism and apartheid, which is that not even the apartheid state thought of a system in which you can make people every day of their lives queue up for 5 hours a day in order to be humiliated by an 18-year-old simply because they want to go and perform some errand across a checkpoint. Anybody who has any doubts about the brutality of the Israeli state simply needs to spend a morning at a checkpoint. And if you're interested in what happens at checkpoints and you don't have the time to go yourself, there is a courageous group of people, which includes, I'm proud to say, quite a few South Africans, who are organized by the World Council of Churches, who gather every day and monitor what goes on at the checkpoints and report to the world on what is happening there. And those reports make alarming reading. I will simply illustrate it by one example and then move on to the bigger issues. As I've indicated, for 2.5 hours on average, the average Palestinian person who wants to go into Israeli-held Jerusalem has to queue. When people get to the front of the queue, you are obliged to do two things. You have to present your documents to a soldier behind a plastic shield. So you put your one hand up with your documents, and then you have to put your other hand up because they conduct what are called biometric tests, which you now come across, those of us who travel around the world at various airports, etc. So you are standing there with one hand on each piece of perspex, which is not a particularly comfortable place to be. And there are recorded instances of Israeli soldiers who then pick up their cell phones and have discussions with their friends for 15 minutes while you stand there. There are recorded instances of female Israeli soldiers who do their nails for 15 minutes. And quite clearly what is going on there is a quite deliberate attempt to dehumanize and humiliate a group of people. And that's not an accident. It's not based simply on the fact that you have some soldiers who are particularly unpleasant. It is based on the reality of the Zionist principle of the Iron Wall, which the Israeli historian Avi Shleim has written about with such powerful effect. And the idea of the Iron Wall is simply this, that Israeli politicians from the 1920s have operated under the assumption, the entirely accurate assumption, that the Palestinian people will never accept the seizure of their lands and their occupation by an alien group. And that the only way in order to maintain the state is to reduce the Palestinian people to such a state of fear that they cannot resist. Now, apartheid didn't think of that. Apartheid didn't think of trying to so humiliate people, so dehumanize them that they would comply simply because they felt that there was no alternative. But that is the Iron Wall strategy on which Israeli domination of Palestinians is based. But if one takes away that rather grotesque elaboration of the Iron Wall, then one is left with a fairly straightforward apartheid system. You are dealing with a system in which one group, using ethnicity and race as a criterion, dominates the lands of another group, in which that group, in effect, denies the citizenship of the other group. Now, you will be told that there are Palestinians called Israeli Arabs who are nominally citizens who are allowed to vote. There are 2 points about that which need to be stressed. They are allowed to vote simply because they are a very small minority. I can assure you that if black African South Africans had been 20% of the population, at some point the apartheid state would have thought of giving black Africans the vote because it wouldn't have made any difference. And secondly, there is in fact no such thing as an Israeli citizen, because civil rights groups in the State of Israel have been trying for many years to win the right to have Israeli citizens stamped in your passport, and they have failed repeatedly because, in fact, the only thing that can be stamped in your passport wherever you were born there is either Jewish or Arab or other, like other colored. We have the same sort of criteria. So, in fact, citizenship is not recognized, and one needs to bear in mind that in the contemporary state of Israel, in the mainstream, the left-wing position in the state of Israel today is Bantustan's. Okay? The left-wing position is what is called the two-state solution, or which some of us call the two-state problem. And the two-state problem is that you take the West Bank and Gaza and you give them to the Palestinian people as Bantustans. That is the left-wing position. The right-wing position is what is called transfer, which means that you don't give them any land, whatever. You expel them to the state of Jordan and leave it to other people to solve the problem. Now, that is a pretty extreme form of apartheid. And then, of course, as we go on, we discover all the other features of apartheid. Detention without trial, seizure of property, land in the state of Israel is owned by something called the Jewish Agency, which has a mandate to ensure that its land is owned by Jews only. So whether you're a Palestinian who's lived there your whole life or not, you have less right to that land than a Jewish person who's lived in New York for their entire life. And so we go on. So this is, in effect, an apartheid state. It needs to be called an apartheid state. And until it is called an apartheid state, then these kinds of grotesqueries that I've described, that I heard on Monday, will persist. Because really the challenge that needs to be thrown back to people, would the former DG of Water Affairs be talking about this in the same way if it was some spokesperson of the apartheid state saying, well, of course we use water to oppress black people. Nothing wrong with that among honest and civilized people. Presumably he wouldn't accept that. Would he accept, did people around the world accept the idea that people like Lucas Mangope and urban Bantu councillors, if they were taken around in tow by Eshel Rudi, who's a name some of us are old enough to remember, who was the travelling salesperson paid by the apartheid state, would that have been regarded as acceptable? No, it would not have been regarded as acceptable. And therefore what we need to do is to reframe the conflict so it is understood as what it really is. Now, we need to do this for a number of reasons. The first reason we obviously need to do it is that it's the truth. And the truth is sometimes worth fighting for in politics. The second reason is that I said that looked at from the point of view of the oppressing group, it is apartheid. But the analogy with our situation here in South Africa is not quite as neat when we come to the question of the oppressed group. And the reason for that, I believe, very often people argue that there are two features of the Palestinian plight, the Palestinian condition, which makes it different from here. I think one is a misapprehension, and the other one is accurate. And let me talk about the one that's accurate, first of all. The problem the Palestinians have is that the Israelis do not need their labor. And that is a very serious problem. It's been written here by various commentators, whatever fantasies, various people like the former minister Connie Mulder, who tried to abolish black South Africans, might have had. The reality, as one commentator very aptly put it in 1969, is that in apartheid the country could not manage without black labor for more than a split second. That is the truth. The whole place would have ground to a halt without black people for more than a split second. Unfortunately, Palestinians find themselves in a situation where they do not have that bargaining power, where the Israelis have other options, where they can exclude them. There are Palestinians whose labor is needed by the State of Israel, but it is unfortunately not true that the State of Israel would ground to a halt if they didn't have Palestinian labor. And this doesn't only affect important institutions like the trade union movement, it really affects people's bargaining power and people's ability to organize in quite profound ways. And that brings me to the other one, which is supposed to be a difference from apartheid. And that is the one which I think we very urgently need to change. It is said that the other difference from apartheid is that the Israeli state has the major powers of the world on its side in a way that the apartheid state never did. Now, this is a bit of a misunderstanding. It is perfectly true that by the 1980s, the apartheid state did not have the support of the major powers in the world. But that's certainly not correct in the 1950s, when the major powers, or certainly the major Western powers, would have been a bit embarrassed about denouncing apartheid because they were doing exactly the same thing in their colonies throughout the rest of the continent. And it certainly wasn't true in the 1960s and the 1970s, when many mainstream governments in the West supported apartheid. The point is that by the end of apartheid's life, it had been rejected by most civilized people because people worked very hard politically to bring that about. And if people hadn't worked to bring that about politically, then it would never have happened. And while it is perfectly true that as we speak today, the Israeli state enjoys massive support in the West in particular, there is no reason that that cannot change, and I believe that it will change, but it will only change when people of goodwill begin to make a change. It's very important in this respect to remember that it was not the governments, it was certainly not the Western governments of the world who turned against apartheid. The Western governments of the world, quite frankly, were dragged kicking and screaming very late into the apartheid struggle, anti-apartheid struggle by their citizens. The anti-apartheid movement was fundamentally a citizens' movement run by trade union groups and church groups and solidarity groups all over the Western world. And as staunch a fan of apartheid as Ronald Reagan, and he was a fan of apartheid, was forced to sign the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act because the citizens' movements in the United States had so effectively turned around United States politics that Republican senators were telling him that it was in the interests of the Republican Party to sign. So this is a very important illustration of how an international balance of power can be turned around. Now, the reason it desperately needs to be turned around is that the consequences of the absence of the labour bargaining power that I've talked about is that I think that the Palestinian struggle for some time is going to proceed, in a sense, in the opposite way to the way the South African struggle did. Because the South African struggle could proceed on the basis of a very strong resistance movement within the country, who the international community could then support, people of goodwill should now support. What is going to happen, I believe, in the Palestinian case is that for quite a while at the outset, the action is going to be happening internationally, because that is where the leverage lies, that's where the bargaining power lies. Now, one needs to clarify what is going on here, because one of the many bits of Zionist mythology which are being spouted when we fought the Ben Gurion fight at UJ is that when some of us make this argument, what we are saying is all us paternalists around the world are going to go and liberate the Palestinian people for them. We are not saying anything of the sort. The international movement to isolate the Israeli state is a Palestinian movement which was developed by Palestinians, thought of by Palestinians, is run by Palestinians to this day. Ramallah is the heart of the movement, not Johannesburg or Pretoria, let alone New York, Paris or London. But the movement is being run by Palestinians who understand that given the labour problem which I described, their leverage is an international leverage. And it seems to me that the international struggle is not only going to be what tips the scales, but it is going to be what develops the kind of renewed Palestinian organization which is so necessary for the Palestinian people. It's very interesting that the resistance movement in Palestine, that the resistance movement which is beginning to take on all over the world, is not being led by the traditional political organizations. It's being led by civil society. It's being led by the trade unions and the cultural organizations and the women's organizations and the religious organizations. Because it is, and this is a cliche which some of us sometimes use, but sometimes cliches describe reality, it is indeed a people's movement. It's not coming out of political structures. It may have and I believe that over time it will come to have a political dimension to it. It's already beginning to have a political dimension to it, and I think that when it does have the political dimension, that particular phenomenon will begin to produce the organized, effective internal Palestinian resistance which we had here. Well, if all of this sounds like it's leading somewhere, it's obviously leading somewhere, because if we need to reframe the struggle, if we need to support Palestinian pressures internationally, we are in a fortunate position. We have been for some years in a fortunate position, because everything I've described that ought to happen is beginning to happen. And it's beginning to happen as a result of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, which emerged out of organizations in Ramallah. I believe that the BDS movement has the capacity over time to change the balance of power internationally. I think that when it changes the balance of power internationally, it will begin to have the effect of changing the balance of power on the ground within historical Palestine. And I believe, if that's important to you, if you are concerned about the values of the movement, if you are concerned that you want to support a movement which is secular and democratic, the BDS movement is secular and democratic, because the BDS movement has no choice but to be secular and democratic. Because if you are playing the politics of trying to reach people's consciences, and you're playing the politics of trying to get citizens of goodwill around the world to support you, you have to do it on the basis of shared human values. Otherwise, people are not going to listen to you. So in a sense, it's not only a more effective Palestinian politics, it's not only a liberatory Palestinian politics, it's a Palestinian politics which I think conforms with the kind of values of documents like the Freedom Charter, of documents which underpin our struggle against apartheid. So I think that the lesson I've tried to sketch here is very simple, that those of us who do want to identify with the Palestinian demand for justice have a task ahead of us. We have a very clear duty to support the BDS movement. We have a very clear duty to strengthen the BDS movement by reframing the conflict, and reframing the conflict means, in a sense, apartheidizing the conflict, making these links with apartheid, which incidentally, in brackets, terrify every strategic Israeli politician that I'm aware of, for very good reasons, because they know how damaging it is. And we need to get, quite frankly, because that is our human responsibility, we need to get a lot more energetic, a lot more sophisticated, and a lot more effective at ensuring that just as apartheid became an international pariah, so anybody of humanity and goodwill around the world will insist that having nothing to do with a state which oppresses the Palestinian people is their human duty. Thank you.